Welcome to Cures and Capital, the podcast on value creation in biotech and pharma. I am Simon.
I'm Martin.
And today we are talking to Murray Aitken. Murray is the Executive Director of the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science. He is a renowned expert on the challenges facing the global healthcare industry, and he knows what he's talking about. He has been in the industry for decades. Prior to his time at IQVIA, Murray was a partner at McKinsey in New Jersey and Los Angeles in the US and in Seoul, South Korea, covering a broad range of industries, including the life science sector. So, Martin, what can our listeners expect today?
Quite a lot. Since Murray has been around for quite a while, he has quite a lot to say. But we will start with the big picture outlook of the entire industry. And then we will look more specifically into the progress the industry is making through IQVIA's indicators of progress. We will also look at the current state of the industry and surrounding uncertainties, where AI is playing quite a big role. And then our favorite topic, we will look into productivity and more specifically the development timelines and probabilities of success and the levers to improve these and much more.
And after the interview with Murray Aitken, Martin and I will go over our reflections. And as always, all views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our employers.
And now please welcome Murray Aitken.
Hi, Murray. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi there. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much. So maybe to get us started, maybe you can talk a little bit about your bio.
Sure. So I have a business background. I sort of came up through business school and then a long stint at McKinsey where I was a partner, mostly working actually outside of the life sciences sector. But the last 4 years I was focused there. I then moved over now 24 years ago to what was then IMS Health to really start the services and consulting business within IMS Health, which at that time was purely a data company. I had various roles for about 10 years. And then in 2011, we launched the IMS Institute. And the idea there was to create a platform for research and thought leadership to help inform all stakeholders of what's going on in and around healthcare by undertaking independent, objective research, evidence-based research, and putting that into the public domain as a public service so that everyone can access that information and use it. And I've been doing that again for the last 14 years, and that included the transition or the merger between IMS Health and Quintiles, which then brought us since 2016 into looking not only at the commercial market for drugs, but also importantly, what's happening in R&D. So that's, broadly my background. I was born and raised and had my undergraduate education in New Zealand. I grew up on a sheep farm, which is not unusual when you come from that part of the world. Have lived most of the rest of the time in the US, although I did spend 6 years based in South Korea, spent a lot of time in China or Japan, as well as Korea and other parts of Southeast Asia as well. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm now living and based in New Jersey, where I've been for the last 20 plus years.
Super interesting. So you're a very busy man over many years, and also just the beginning of the year here, you have spent a lot of time traveling around, of course, starting with JP Morgan, but you've been meeting so many other stakeholders in other countries. So I'm really curious to see what is top of mind for people out there here in 2025, executives across the industry.
Yeah. So, I spent a week or so in San Francisco around the JP Morgan week. And remember that that's a gathering mostly of smaller emerging biopharma companies and their investors, although certainly there's people from across the ecosystem there. I sort of came away with a sense that the mood is that people are pensive, but not panicked.
Uh-huh.
And I think the reason for that is science drives the mood, particularly in that meeting in San Francisco, because it's full of new science. It's full of people wanting to talk about their latest, preclinical developments and so on. I think also people are optimistic that deal making is about to resume more significant way than it did over the last couple of years. The new FTC head, another year of expectation that interest rates will come down, although that was expected a year ago and didn't quite turn out that way. But I think still there's optimism that the deal making side of things is looking more positive, and that's clearly important again to the sort of people who are gathering in San Francisco, to the extent investors are looking for exits through IPOs or M&A or whatever. I was also in Europe last week, including a couple of days in Brussels but that was more with policymakers. And I think there, what I took away was, there's a new parliament, there's a new health commissioner, there's a new focus on European competitiveness that comes through in those conversations, but also a recognition there's a lot to be done, a recognition that there has been a loss of global share of activity in Europe just to the US, but also that China is coming up from behind, and some concern about what it's going to take to turn things around across Europe and build the level of competitiveness. I would also say a couple of other things, sort of common things that actually came up in both San Francisco and in Brussels. One, just a deep and broad interest in AI. And, it does come up in every conversation. And by the way, that's even before the DeepSeek news and attention of the past few days. I would call AI as it's omnipresent, even if it's not yet omniscient. And again, I make that point to mean that everyone is talking about the application of AI, whether it's the FDA commissioner talking about how they are using it and want to use it to review submissions. Clearly what's happening in discovery research, clinical development, productivity applications, finding patients in the real world, and so on. So it's omnipresent, but it's also clear it's not perfect yet. It doesn't know everything. And, and I think we still have yet to see the compelling sort of sector-wide evidence of the impact that it's having. So that being said, a lot of interest. I think in Europe, I think it's interesting the way the European health data space is being discussed as a platform for Europe to be much more advanced in healthcare related AI, which I think is, some would say will give a competitive edge to Europe against the US, which remains very fragmented in terms of its health data space. I think that's interesting. And then finally, I would say clearly everyone is interested in talking about the impact of the change in US administration. Happened while I was in Europe. I would say, a lot of speculation, but also a lot of recognition that it really is impossible to predict the way things might go for the life sciences sector with the new administration. There's puts and takes. There's also different personalities, who are in play, if not yet confirmed, for key positions, whether it's Elon Musk and Doge, whether it's RFK Jr., at HHS and others. And I think, how the rhetoric translates into reality is still very much an open question, but it's definitely everybody wants to know what you think, even if, the reality is at this stage, it's it's impossible to really predict which way things are going to turn in the coming year, let alone the coming 4 years. So but that was definitely an area of common interest and conversation.
Yeah, those are super interesting themes, and it's a very complex picture you paint here. And of course, you're very passionate about the entire industry. So I'm also, what is your personal take? Are you optimistic? Are you worried?
So overall, I'm an optimist, and I think pretty much everyone in this sector is at some level. Certainly, those involved in R&D have to be by definition optimists to keep doing what they do. I have also been watching this industry for, now almost 30 years. It is an industry of great resilience. It is an industry that knows how to adapt, and it is one that I continue to be confident will, overcome sort of what gets thrown at them. So my general stance is never to overreact to the latest policy change or the latest denial of reimbursement here, or whatever, because I'm confident that we'll find a way around it. If the science is good, the unmet needs are still large. we need healthcare, and the industry, the individual companies that make up this industry will survive and will ultimately will prosper. And I think, again, there's been many calls over the 30 years I've been watching to, the industry needs to be more consolidated, or the industry needs to companies need to break up into, the different discovery research, just get rid of it, and so on. And, the only common thread I would say is there has been an increasing focus by companies in the sector to double down on their focus on innovation.
Yeah.
And indeed, if you look at the sort of corporate strategies of the large companies, they've shed non-innovative medicine businesses to enable them to, stay focused on that part of their business. So let's get rid of the generics, or let's get rid of consumer health or animal health, and so on. And I think that is, a positive reflection on the resilience of the sector, and the fact that we're going to keep moving forward in a positive way, despite whatever curveballs get thrown at the industry.
No, but I think that was, I almost feel like that was a relief, what you just said there. So I hear this is a stable industry. Innovation will pull us through if we do it right.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I spent a lot of time talking with colleagues here, pulling them away from the doom and gloom end of the spectrum. I also like to pull people back from the hype end of things as well. Because again, when you've been around, a while, that those are very rarely, what actually comes to pass.
Yeah.
So the reality ends up somewhere in the middle, and, we should have confidence in that, and, stay focused and keep moving forward.
Yeah. So you already alluded a little bit to it when you talked about the JP Morgan conference. That's not the entire universe. That's just one part of the total life science universe. And that gets me to the next topic. So IQVIA Institute issued this research brief in the beginning of the year, 2025, Indicators of Progress for the Life Science Sector, which really takes this high-level view of the entire life science sector. Can you speak a little bit about what is the purpose and approach around that?
Yeah, so at the beginning of 2024, actually, we started thinking about the level of anxiety and uncertainty that there was at that time about how the sector was performing, how it was evolving, what lies ahead, and so on. And rather than try to predict the future, we thought it'd be better to say, what would have to happen to signal positive progress for the life sciences sector this year? And how would you know if that progress was made? Meaning, in our terms, you've got to have a metric or something tangible that you can measure to be able to come back a year later and see if things actually did progress. So we came up with 7 areas that we thought would be indicators. Again, if we saw progress there, it would be a good thing for the life sciences sector. I have to say, we published the update on what actually happened in 2024, and in all but one of those 7 indicators, we did not see progress. We saw sideways movement, or even backward movement by the end of the year. But then we said, okay, well, let's do this again, or refresh this a bit for 2025. So we came up with, actually this year, 10 different indicators. They sort of range from the public perception of the pharmaceutical industry, which we do think is a fundamental problem for the sector. And if we don't move off being at the low end of, those sorts of surveys about the industry, it's not good for the sector, through to how many patients will be treated this year with innovative sickle cell gene therapies. Again, not to focus on that particular therapy, but because that will be an important indicator of progress in the system to be able to translate these approved therapies into patient benefits. And if we reach a certain, level of treatment actually happening, that will mean that, the other parts of the health system have come together to enable those approved therapies to reach patients. So it's a proxy measure, if you like, something that we do think is important for the life sciences sector to advance, because we've got a lot of advanced therapies coming through the pipeline and into the commercialization phase that are not necessarily meeting as many patients as would be ideal. And it's not because the science in the therapeutic is a problem. It's because the other parts of the health system that need to come together are not really making similar progress. Anyway, so we came up with our 10 indicators. We've laid them all out in a little report. We'll be watching over the course of the year to see whether the indicators are making progress or not, and we'll be able to report back at the end of the year.
Yeah. No, and just for our listeners, we will of course link to the reports and the work we discuss here. It's fabulous analysis that you make available for everyone to read. So we'll make sure to link to that. So, and I'm curious because everything you put out, I'm a big fan of the work of IQVIA Institute, but maybe a question out of curiosity, how do these things actually come to be inside the meetings you have? I mean, can you raise the curtains a little bit? What is the discussions of?
Yeah. So in terms of how we both set our research agenda and how we, in the case of the indicators, came up with those.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we talk a lot. Well, we're very active externally, so I'm in front of external audiences most of the time. That's why I travel a lot. We're always listening and getting input and feedback and reflecting on that. We also engage with our internal colleagues at IQVIA. Again, we're a company of 90,000 plus people who are active all around the world across all parts of the life sciences sector and all stages of development and commercialization and so on. So we have a lot of perspectives that we can draw on. So we look to get their input as to areas that we should focus on. And then within our small team, we also have our brainstorming. And in the case of the indicators to watch, that came out of an internal brainstorm where we came up with a bunch of ideas. Then we went away and thought about the practicality of finding metrics that would meet those particular areas, shortened the list a bit, iterated a few times before we finalize it. So, I mean, it's really those three kind of approaches that we take to determine where we spend our time and energy.
No, I think that sounds like a super interesting to be part of. So before we dive into some of the specific indicators of the research brief, is there any, or how would you characterize the current environment, say, from the perspective of biotech and pharma executives?
So overall, I would say the executives are very positive and optimistic when you talk about the science, the deepening of our understanding of human biology and disease, where genomics is taking us, the new focus on areas such as cell regeneration, which I heard a lot about at JP Morgan, or protein degraders, which seems to be getting a lot of buzz and attention, masked bispecifics, gene therapies as well continue to evolve. So, a lot of positive momentum coming out of the science. But I think executives are a little more sanguine, shall we say, when considering what it takes to commercialize drugs, to gain reimbursement for their therapeutics, the access barriers that are out there, the gap between the therapeutics and modalities that are emerging from R&D efforts and the capacity of the infrastructure to actually enable patients to benefit from them. And whether that's in the form of diagnostics that are required and need to be reimbursed and available, the patient referral pathways and how those evolve as new treatment options become available, specialized infrastructure to deliver some of these new modalities, the workforce requirements that are needed, the guidelines that need to be adapted, right? There's a lot of elements that that are required to come together and be in place for this great science to translate to patient benefit. And we're seeing that, and we've done quite a bit of work around radioligand therapies, for example, and seeing how that modality, which is gaining traction, we've got more companies coming up and investing in this area. Novartis obviously is already so well in place there, but we've got other companies coming in as well. CAR Ts, which I think, again, have been around for a while, but still face some challenges in terms of the infrastructure and availability to be able to provide those therapies to patients. Gene therapies as well. I mentioned sickle cell before, and that's one that we've got approved gene therapies, but their use is still, very, very limited. Alzheimer's disease treatments, I think, also have had their challenges in terms of, again, not so much the drug, it's what it takes to enable the patient to get the benefit of the drug. So in these areas, the new science, the new modalities face growing challenges from other parts of the healthcare system. And I think, for executives in the, biotech and pharma, their issue is what can they do about that? Because it's a very different environment than when, okay, we've got a small molecule pill and it can be dispensed through a retail pharmacy. Okay, we know how to do that. We've got more and more of the innovation taking on different forms and putting additional burdens and requirements on other parts of the health system that need to fund these investments, that need to train the workforce, right, et cetera. And so that level of complexity is sitting in front of pharma executives today, looking to be able to commercialize their innovation, to enable that innovation to deliver the full value that it can to patients. And I think we don't yet have a good way to deal with this, to have the conversations with the other parts of the health system, to undertake the horizon scanning, to give some heads up in advance as to what's coming through the pipeline and what impact that might have on other parts of the health system. It's still a pretty ad hoc approach, I would say. And that's one of the biggest issues that biotech and pharma executives face these days, because it's becoming a bigger and bigger barrier. That gap between the science and what it takes to deliver the science to patients is getting bigger.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. And now just maybe a follow-up question. So you say that a little bit the healthcare system is, the different entities are not talking together in the way they perhaps should. Is there any practical advice? I mean, would it just have to evolve over time?
So I think that between the regulators, the payers, the manufacturers, and the health delivery system, hospitals, clinics, and so on. I mean, I think those parties don't have a sort of regular convening, mechanism to enable the sort of discussion that I think is needed with the appropriate lead time to share with each other what's going on and ways to, overcome some of the barriers and to short circuit things. I think, too often we wait until a drug's approved, and then the next question is, well, okay, how are we going to get it reimbursed?
Yeah.
Then it's like, well, how are we going to get it actually delivered? When some of that could have been discussed several years earlier.
No, but that's a really just a reminder how complex this industry is. And you already mentioned a little bit about the uncertainty, and then the research brief on the indicators of progress states as there's no shortage of uncertainty, but is there more uncertainty than there used to be?
So I think there's always uncertainty about the future. I think, one of the sayings is if you must predict often, because of that level of uncertainty. But I do think there's incremental uncertainty now, and I would attribute that to two main factors. I think geopolitics has become more relevant and more important and more uncertain, whether that be looking at the relationship between China and the US for certain, the West more generally. And how that's going to play out. I think obviously within Europe, the war is a geopolitical factor that creates instability and uncertainty. And then within the US, with the new administration that has, in 1 week made some pretty dramatic changes. That also, though, is bringing uncertainty as to what lies in week 2 and 3 and 4 and the rest of the 4 years of the administration. I think the second level of uncertainty, comes from the impact of how AI will transform things. There are some who are very bullish about how rapidly AI is going to evolve. I mean, we hear things, in terms of, by the end of this year, right, we're going to have a radical shift in things, which raises the question, how long will it be before we really won't need treatments for advanced disease, because there won't be any advanced disease because we will have applied AI in some way to intercept disease, or it manifests, in a human, right? I mean, and you can definitely lay out the scenario that, that's where we're going to be. The optimist might be suggesting that's going to happen, in 3 to 5 years. I don't subscribe to that, but there is this level of uncertainty about just how far AI can go in healthcare, in the different parts of healthcare, and the magnitude of the impact that will have, going well beyond, simply doing what we do now more efficiently. That's something we can already see the impact of, or the ability to, apply protein folding capabilities and so on, and identify, many new targets at lower cost and get those into the clinic and so on, right? Those are all things we can see happening. But there's also the more sort of fundamental role that AI could be playing in terms of preventing disease, intercepting disease in the sort of pre-disease stage that we don't know if that's going to be reality or when. So I think the geopolitics and AI are sort of the two elements that mean we're in a period of greater than usual uncertainty about how things are going to unfold over the next 5-10 years.
So my next question, I can see Martin is eager to get some questions in. I just have one question, Martin, before I'll hand it over to you. So we discussed, and also your research brief mentions this, that there are two fundamental elements that need to be in place in a healthcare system for it to function. So one thing is that, of course, the patients, they have access. You already touched on potential access challenges for these advanced therapies. And the next thing is that there's not prohibitive costs for the patients facing this. So is there any practical advice around how you see these two fundamental factors? I mean, let's say we have biotech or pharma executives starting a strategy process. Do I just have to sit and watch, or can I do something in how I think about my strategy? Or
so my view on this is, again, having watched the industry for more than a couple of decades, historically the industry has somewhat acted as a player outside of the rest of the healthcare system. That's focused on innovation, it's focused on research, it's focused on developing these great, therapeutics, and then sort of throw them over the wall into the health system to get reimbursement, to get patient access, to get them delivered to patients and so on. And I think that can't be the way of the future, in part because of the different level of complexity in what they're bringing through the R&D pipeline, as I've discussed, and partly because the constraints on the rest of the health system are also increasing, whether it be the budgetary pressures, the workforce pressures, and so on. So I do think, from a strategy perspective, leaders in life sciences companies do need to lean in to engage with the rest of the health system on understanding the constraints that they face, and actually working a bit more together than they have in the past. So, one example of that would be, there's always a lot of effort from the drug developers to demonstrate the value of their new medicines, the clinical value, the economic value, and so on. But rarely, if ever, do companies leverage the real world evidence or the clinical evidence to actually say, you know what, this drug is now no longer the most effective for this patient subpopulation, which may be something they've only discovered by leveraging the real world evidence that's generated and identifying actually there's a cohort of patients who are not responding to this drug. And we should let not only the healthcare professionals, but also payers know about this, because this makes this drug a low value drug for this part of the population, for example, right? That kind of mechanism doesn't happen. There is no mechanism for that sort of analysis to be done or to be put forward. Instead, we're reliant on the payers figuring that out for themselves, or the regulators figuring that out for themselves. And we know that that's a tall order. for those stakeholders. So that's an example where, the innovative companies have the skills, they probably have the data and the evidence to be able to do more of that. It may be the new way of thinking about creating headroom for innovation, which is a tagline that, has been used to promote the adoption of lower cost generics or biosimilars in order to free up funding for the next generation of innovation. But perhaps we could also say, even for existing protected drugs, during their periods of exclusivity, there's also the opportunity to create headroom for innovation by reducing the use and promotion of low value drugs, particularly to subpopulations, and free up that resource to be able to redeploy to therapeutics of higher value to that subpopulation. This is something, again, that is a bit contrary to the way things are being done today, but it's an example of, if you're really leaning in and being part of the full system, it's something that perhaps you could think about doing.
So I think that was system thinking is needed more in the industry. And I think with that, Martin, over to you.
Yes, let's have a look at something that have been a focus area of ours for the last couple of episodes, and that's more specifically productivity, and hopefully some levers that can help improve the productivity that we have seen. I will start with where we are today, and there's a very frustrating fact in your research brief, and that is that the median time for a first patent filing to US launch for a new drug is 13.8 years. Can you speak to this and how the underlying data set has evolved over the last 10 years?
Yeah. So one of the metrics that we track in the R&D trends report annually is the length of time from the original patent filing of a molecule to the time that it comes through regulatory approval and is available to patients. So we can think of that as patent to patient timeline. So it's not restricted to active clinical development time. The clock starts when someone somewhere thought that a molecule had some value, and to that extent thought it was worth protecting that value by applying for a patent, right? So that to us is a useful way to think about when the clock starts. And then we track from then, how long does it take to actually reach patients? And for the cohort of US novel active substance approvals, that clocked in at, it's about 13 and a half years or so in 2023. It looks like 2024 is going to be even higher. We haven't finalized our trend report yet. The low point was 10.4 years in 2020. And some of the emergency use authorizations helped that. High point in the last 10 years has been 16 years. And there's a couple of things about this. One is we do see some drugs make it in less than 5 years, which is remarkable. It's not common, but it has happened. And there's a good many in the 5 to 10 years, which we would say is, to us, 10 years is a good target to be looking for. But it's also clear that the ones that are taking 15, 20, even more years from that original patent filing, these are drugs that have been sort of sidelined, typically somewhere along their pathway. They've been put on the shelf.
Yeah.
They've changed hands in many cases. In some cases, because this is a US metric, they might have actually even been approved in Europe, but not made it to the US market for one reason or another, but eventually they do. There's also some drugs that, have developed a new indication, which then gets through regulatory review. So again, there's different factors coming into play, but ultimately it's a long time from that initial recognition of value. So let's patent that to the time it crosses the line and becomes available to patients.
I have actually a small sub question, because you mentioned that there's this target to aspire for of 10 years, but it also that basically within this time frame, it was only achieved during 2020 because of the emergency approvals. Is it a realistic target that companies could aspire to, or is it more something that is out of the ordinary?
I think 5 to 10 years is where companies can realistically focus their efforts, and again, we see companies doing it. So often they're small companies, they're emerging biopharma companies pursuing rare diseases, but some of that is coming through fairly quickly.
Now you mentioned that this is basically from the entire lifetime from patent to launch in the US, but you're also looking specifically at the development timelines in your report. How would you advise the biotech and pharma companies or leaders to think about how they could, if they wanted to make it faster or if they wanted to improve the speed, what should they do to be able to do it?
I think there's a couple of different areas where significant progress can be made to move the needle on timelines. There's operational elements and there's decision-making elements, and I would sort of separate those a little bit. On the operational side, we know that when it comes to protocol development, there's not always enough time and attention given to recognizing how eligibility criteria affects enrollment times, which we've seen trending up since before the pandemic, how endpoints determine the number of data points to be gathered, the number of procedures and type of procedures that are needed in the protocol. And by the way, protocol amendments still continue to be a reality in many, many cases that typically only ever results in longer timelines. But there's also then the decision-making elements, and this gets back to the issue of white space, particularly the time that elapses between the completion of one phase and the start of the next. We saw during COVID-19 how that white space can be eliminated, as it essentially was for the vaccine trials. We did a report that really drilled into how CROs, and specifically we were looking at our own involvement in some of those trials. What did we do differently as a CRO? How did we engage differently with the sponsor to enable us to dramatically shrink some of the key operational timelines that the CRO, is typically involved in? And there, it was a lot about the relationships between the sites, the investigators, the CRO, the sponsors, the regulators. Everyone was on speed dial to each other. Everyone was willing to come together on a Sunday night to resolve issues there and then, right? And I realized that was an exceptional time, but it is also a reminder that there are ways to streamline decision-making, to expedite that decision-making, and to parallel process some things. It may come at a slightly higher cost. We saw that in some of the front loading of activities that we did as a CRO that we wouldn't typically do because it's more expensive, but that has the benefit of resulting in shorter timelines. So I don't think we've yet sort of gone through all the steps needed to think about how to optimize the decision making. Then I think there's the incorporation of technology, which is the other means by which we can move the needle on timelines. And whether that's e-COAs and e-consents and deploying technology to capture data more quickly and more efficiently. And then, when you apply AI to developing the data package and the biostats and all of that, right, there's still, I think, significant amount of opportunity there. We would also say selecting sites and the enrollment strategies that are used continues to be a problem generally. And again, our data is showing that enrollment times are slowing down for a variety of reasons, but it makes it even more important that you're applying the right approach to selecting and prioritizing those sites. And we think that's another area where there's measurable improvement that can be made that can cut many months off the enrollment duration. So those are, I think some of the operational areas as well as some of the sort of decision-making opportunities there are to move the needle on clinical development productivity.
I wonder, before I zoom into the next driver, is there one of these that particularly stand out? I mean, if I wanted to go by the 80-20 principle and I want to choose one that can really move the needle, would there be one you say that, okay, removing the white space, that's the one you should maybe focus on? Or it's hard to say it like this?
I think it's hard to say. You have to get the protocol right. And I think, at the end of that is at the core of the development cycle. But then I think the white space, some of that white space is needed to really consider what the next step is in that development program, particularly as the external environment changes, somewhat. But, do we need to wait a month for the next meeting, or can we do it in a week? Do we need to wait a week, or can we do it in a day? Need to do it in a day, or can we pick up the phone and do it in an hour? Right? I mean, these are these are still
Right.
opportunities that are generally out there to seize that as an opportunity.
So we have just talked about the development timelines, but that's of course just one part of the productivity equation. Another critical parameter, of course, is the probability of success. So the clinical success rates, and especially the phase 2 probability of success, is a very, very risky phase. Where do we stand on our clinical success rates when you look at it from where we are today?
If you just look at the success rate metrics, we seem to be stuck. We're stuck at give or take 10% composite rate from starting phase 1 to regulatory approval, about 45% based on our methodology for phase 1, about 36% for phase 2, 56% for phase 3, 80+% for regulatory submission approval. And it bops up and down, but broadly we're at that level. I think that the question is, what's behind that? And it could be there are two offsetting factors. One is the opportunity to reduce risk by being better at deploying AI or whatever to anticipate how the trial is going to unfold, the digital twin approach being applied and so on, all of which could take risk out of the development program. But the other factor that could be offsetting that is we want to take more scientific risk in order to come up with a therapeutic that delivers more impact in currently untreated or undertreated area. And I think it's the balance between those two that determines what the overall success rate is. And I don't quite know the right way to think about this. Is 10% sort of a given, and then we sort of just work within that? Obviously, we know how to increase success rates, take less risk, right? Let's put drugs through development that we already know what the answer is going to be, right? So we do know how to improve success rate. I do feel sometimes when the discussion is around what do we need to do to improve success, well, it actually is pretty easy if you think that's what you want to do. But that's not the business we're in. That's not the construct we're in. We know that risk and return are correlated. I think what we want to ensure is that the sort of operational risks diminished so that we can take more what I would call scientific risk as we move things through the development pathway. And I think that's at the essence, at the core of the decisions that get made about what to invest in, what to progress through development, and then what success rate will pop out, the other end.
You put it into perspective quite nicely. I think a lot of people focus on the probability of success, and if it goes down, it's bad. But it also correlates with the kind of innovation you want to have. So, of course, the higher the probability of success, probably the more incremental is the innovation, right?
That being said, when we reported in 2022 that the composite success rate was down to 5.9%, that sort of gave me pause. Notwithstanding what you just said and what I just said, it still seems like, wow, that's a really low number. Yes. So I was a little bit reassured when it went back up to 10.8% in 2023, and we're still working on the 2024 number. Again, not to get obsessed around exactly what the number is, but in order to be sustainable, we probably still need something higher than a 5% success rate, or even lower.
Yeah.
But I think you kind of explained a little bit of the next question. So I'll try to eliminate a part so you don't zoom into what you just said. In your research brief, you highlighted two levers for an organization if they wanted to focus on improving success rates. One of them, of course, is the technical quality of the molecules themselves. The other one is decision-making, such as portfolio decision-making frameworks, and etc. Now, I want to ask you if you can explain a little bit about the decision-making part, but now, of course, you said you can also decide to go for less risky things. So if that wasn't an option and we want to focus on the actual levers, could you focus a little bit of those?
Well, I think the real question that you're trying to answer is what to advance and what to put on the shelf and leave where it is. And I think in that sense, there's both what I would call the technical assessment of the molecule, but the other factor is what's happening in the broader environment, and given the timelines that things are on, what the competitive landscape is looking like, both in terms of competitive R&D, but also competitive commercial landscape as well. And ultimately, it's about a portfolio decision that gets made, because you don't want everything in the high risk, high return quadrant, right? You want to have a portfolio. So it's a constant game of balancing and reassessing. And at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of luck and serendipity involved in this as well. If we pretend otherwise, I think we're also deluding ourselves about how this system works. So I would also explicitly, recognize that as as a factor. As scientists, we might prefer to suggest it's not the case, but perhaps until AI figures out, what's behind luck, it remains a factor in this broader set of decisions that get made.
Absolutely. But now I wonder, so now we talked about the levers of productivity. When you look at the industry's R&D engine, what do you see? Do you think, is it running smoothly overall with all these indicators, or is it not so smooth?
So what I see when I look at the sort of R&D engine is it's being well fueled, a lot of money going into it. Large pharma companies keep spending a higher percentage of their net sales on R&D. The absolute numbers of billions of dollars keeps increasing. The commitment is there. The doubling down on innovation is definitely there. That being said, I'm still struck by how much of a herd instinct there seems to be in this sector around mechanisms and modalities. Antibody drug conjugates, again, look very promising, but then suddenly everyone's, got to have one. Everyone's got the PD ones and the PDL ones. And again, no disrespect to those mechanisms, but the way in which the entire industry stampedes in the same direction still strikes me as curious. I think also when we look at the engine operationally, we've still got a long ways to go, right? Trials still take a long time. There's still a disheartening number of trial sites that enroll 0 or even worse, 1 patient, right? I mean, that's something being focused on for 20 years, 25 years at least, right? Yet it still happens. Protocol amendments, despite all the efforts to avoid those, according to the latest Tufts research, right? That continues to be a major driver of cost and delay. So, animal models, right? We still know are not good predictors of, they're still required by regulators. And maybe that's something that'll change in the not too distant future. Maybe AI is a means to deal with that. But again, within the R&D engine, the reliance on animal models still strikes me as sitting here in the year 2025 as being something, we could better than that. So those kinds of opportunities to improve are still very much out there. The operational issues, deploying the technology, deploying AI in the appropriate and right way. These are still opportunities that can help overcome the realities that trials still take a long time. They're very expensive and they usually fail.
Yes. And I think this feeds very nicely into the next question. So as you said, there's a lot of opportunities for improvement. I think you also mentioned earlier on that you're optimistic about the pharma industry. So putting these two together, where do you actually see the industry's R&D productivity, the R&D engine going in the next 10 years?
So I'm an optimistic at heart. I am optimistic that efforts to improve productivity will pay off, that we'll get the combination of AI plus technology, plus sound managerial decision-making, combining with the remarkable improvements in understanding basic human biology, disease etiology, and so on, all coming together in order to improve productivity. So, that's my stance. That's my mindset. That's where I begin. I do think that with AI, we're going to see better targets identified. They're going to make their way into the clinic faster. We'll be able to identify biomarkers that predict response for more drugs. We'll have better selection of sites, better approaches to finding subjects to enroll in trials. We'll see faster data locks and turnaround. We'll have quicker submissions, being prepared with AI, large language models contributing and so on. I mean, all of these are things that can definitely happen within the next 5 years to fundamentally improve the productivity level.
When we talk about productivity, and we had guests here before, we also we see this trend where a lot of companies, they focus on AI as if this is going to be the one solution to effectively improve productivity. Could it be that companies are maybe over-focusing as this to be the potential solution and forgetting about other ways in which they could do it?
I think it's very easy to be dazzled by AI. I mean, we as a company, we talk about healthcare grade AI to draw the distinction between AI applications in other sectors of society and industry and what it really takes to apply AI in healthcare. And that I think is both in terms of AI models to understand human biology at a cellular level, at a genomic level, as well as understanding healthcare in terms of how healthcare is delivered, how patients respond to treatments, factoring in things like social determinants that impact outcomes and so on. And in both of those types of AI application, the data is more complicated. It's more variable. In many cases, it's not as clean as the data that is able to be accessed and harnessed in other areas of industry and society more generally. And, and again, we've been through a few years of missed promises in terms of the delivery of AI. So I think we all need to be humble as we approach this. That being said, I'm still optimistic about a positive impact coming from it, but maybe not as complete, not as fast, not as risk-free as we might hope for.
But I think it goes well with what you described, Sarah, in the beginning. You are somewhere in between the hype and also complete pessimism. And I think this answer was very much in line with that.
So, Murray, we discussed a lot of things today. Is there something you think we missed or we didn't talk about?
So I think we've had a great discussion. We've covered a lot of, what we look at and think about within the IQVIA Institute. There's much more to say about what's happening in China, which I think deserves a whole session on its own. I would also say that we watch closely the emerging biopharma part of the life sciences sector, and it is the central heart of innovation, even though large pharma companies would like to think they are at the core, but actually the reality is it's the small companies that make the difference. And I think, understanding how they're approaching things, how they're evolving, I think that's another area, we've got more to talk about. And in fact, we'll be issuing a report specifically on the EBP segment later in the year.
Now we are moving more towards the more personal questions. So let me just start with, what have you been reading lately? Are there any great reads you could recommend to us and the listeners?
Well, since I read a lot related to work, I do also, with the encouragement of my wife and daughters, try to read some fiction as well. So I'm halfway through Orbital by Samantha Harvey that won the Booker Man Prize last year, and it's actually not a very thick book, but it's about 6 astronauts in the International Space Station cycling the Earth 16 times over the course of one Earth day. And so I would say it's a lyrical piece. It's beautifully written, and it does trigger a reflection about humanity's relationship to planet Earth, what it means to look from space towards that humanity and Earth. And it's a very different read than, reading policy papers or other forms of research reports.
Absolutely. And I wonder, there was a topic you touched in relation to something completely else, and that is the reputation of the industry. And now I wonder, for the young generation that is maybe thinking of starting a career in life science, is there maybe something you would advise them if they want to consider starting in this industry?
Well, I think we want to encourage all smart young people with an interest in science and an interest in advancing human health to absolutely join this sector. I don't think there's a more, well, maybe AI is sort of the competitor in a sense, although it's very different. But just the level of activity, excitement, progress that's being made in the sector is truly remarkable. And, whenever I'm with a group of people from these companies, it's always a highly energizing meeting or engagement or interaction. And I think for young people sitting out on their careers, know that there's a long pathway here. We're not going to solve everything, within anyone's lifetime, although we're going to make a lot of progress. We're going to find out a lot of new things to pursue and explore. And I think it will continue to be a vital part, not only of industry, but of society more generally.
Absolutely. I mean, just speaking for myself, and I think a little bit for Simon as well, for anyone that wants to join, if you love solving challenges, this is the industry to come into.
Agree.
There's so much value that can be created. Before we get towards the end, I just wonder, so your LinkedIn says that you have been a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences back in 2021. What was that about?
So I'm a visiting professor in practice at LSE. That is essentially around collaborating on research. So I work with the other academics there who are a terrific group of researchers and very smart people. And we collaborate on typically utilizing some of the large data sets that we have at IQVIA to take research, particularly around the use of medicines, how that is changing over time, how that looks globally, and engage in that sort of research, which I find personally very stimulating and very much enjoy the collaboration with LSE.
So just to close this, Simon, of course, mentioned we will link to everything we discussed here in the episode. But how can people get in touch with you, Murray?
So happy to provide my email address and also a QR code that you can use to subscribe to our mailing list. So the IQVIA Institute has a mailing list. We've got 50 or 60,000 people on it. That's the easiest way to stay informed about reports that we're issuing or events that we're holding, and stay up to date with what we're up to here at the IQVIA Institute.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well done, guys.
So, Simon, we just had another great conversation with Murray. And as always, there's a lot to unpack. Let's maybe start with the most practical takeaway we had today. What can we do about our probabilities of success?
Yes, we learned it's actually very simple to increase probability of success. We simply take less risk. And I believe this also points out that you really need to be very careful what you optimize for, how and when and why, because you can actually optimize the wrong things in the wrong manner and destroy value. So that was one practical thing. And then another big topic was around uncertainty. So what stood out to you?
What I really liked was Murray's balanced approach, because he has been here for a while. He pointed out that while AI and geopolitics can create a lot of uncertainty in today's age, the life sciences industry is quite resilient. And he reminded us not to get caught up in the doom and gloom of it or the AI hype. The reality is always somewhere in the middle. The industry is always adapted, and it will continue to do so. One nice thing he mentioned that was that the AI is omnipresent, but it's not omniscient.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we also discussed clinical trial operations and companies struggling with inefficient trial designs and trial conduct. And AI won't magically fix that if you get it wrong from the beginning when you set up and design your trials and then when you execute them. I'm sure AI can help a lot, but it won't fix the problems if you make problems from the beginning. And we are talking more about clinical productivity as well. And I think that statistic we mentioned that 13.8 years from patent to US approval, that's a very long time. I mean, if we can just take out a little bit of the time there, either in the trials or between trials, the white space, that's a huge potential there. And yeah, just eliminate unnecessary delays.
And as you pointed out, I think COVID proved us that it's possible, maybe too extreme, but it also showed what happens when everyone comes together, the regulators, the companies, the CROs. And when they work in sync, the timelines are possible to be shrunk dramatically when decision makers are aligned and ready to act. And I think that's the mindset that pharma needs.
No, I agree. I think there was a lot of practical takeaways from today's discussion. We knew it would be a very high level healthcare conversation, but I think there's still a lot of practical advice for decision makers in the industry, whether it's about cutting white space between trials or thinking about AI risk in your pipeline. So that's some of the things we took away. There were topics we didn't have time to cover, like the Chinese biotech scene. So maybe we can get Murray back for that another time. But besides that, I don't have a lot else to add.
One thing we didn't cover would be that, as always, we would love to hear from you, our listeners, and we would love to know what you think. So please join the discussion. Go to our LinkedIn group, just search for Cures and Capital, and let us know what your thoughts are, what you think, and see you next time.
Thank you.